So it is 6:30, and I will call the meeting to order, and we will begin with the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And can I get a roll call?
Evans.
Here.
Rudder.
Here.
Grable.
Here.
Bangamello.
Here.
Colbert. Here. Frazier.
Here.
Yoshida.
Here.
And Ulig. All right, we have a quorum.
All right. Next, we need to approve the agenda. Can I get a motion?
So moved.
Second.
All right. Everyone in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Okay. And next, we will have the approval of the minutes of May 18th, 2022. Those are all included in your packet. If you haven't had a chance to look over it, please do so. And when you're ready, I'll take a motion in a second.
So moved. Second.
Any discussion?
Any discussion?
And I would just say for the new members, you can abstain from this vote since you weren't at the last meeting. So,
Okay. Everyone in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? All right. Next up is public comment on anything not related to our regular business, or I guess regular business for that matter as well. Nope. Okay. Opening public comment and seeing none, I will close public comment. And we'll move on to regular business, which is the election of the chair and vice chair. Did you have any comments, staff, or I can?
I think you can lead it from here.
Okay.
Chair.
So tonight we're going to be electing a new chair and vice chair for the Planning Commission. We have the option to do that through a secret vote or through just a verbal vote. So I just would like to hear everyone's thoughts on what they would prefer.
I'm open to either. I mean, I think a verbal would be fine for me, though.
I think it might depend on if there are contested, like if there are multiple nominations for chair and vice chair, if there's only one nomination for chair and one for vice chair, then it makes sense. But if there are more than one, I would prefer a secret vote.
I don't think we have a choice, so I think we have to decide now.
you can call for nominations if you want.
We could do that now before entering into the secret? Okay.
I would go ahead and if you want to call for nominations and
Enter the secret vote.
yeah.
Okay.
and nominations, it's just you can nominate yourself, doesn't require a second. So I would do the chair first and then do the chair second, and then guys can decide on how you want to proceed from there.
Okay. So in that case, do we have any nominations for chair?
I nominate Jen Rudder.
A second.
Third.
I don't know if we need that. Are there any other nominations for chair? People can also nominate themselves. Okay. In that case, can we do a roll call vote?
All right. Evans.
Am I saying who I'm voting for, or just saying
I think saying yes.
For the nominee.
I think it's, yeah, it's
So-
the nominee.
yes?
Scrable.
Yes.
Bangamello.
Yes.
Colbert.
Yes.
Frazier.
Yes.
Yoshida.
Yes.
And Rudder.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you. Appreciate that. I will do my best to lead you all. And now we need nominations for a vice chair, and it'll proceed in the same manner.
I nominate Chrissy.
I nominate Crystal. I nominate Ty.
Say no back.
You're not required to accept a nomination.
Okay, so I can push it back.
So you're not interested?
No.
Okay.
All right. Do we have any other nominations besides?
I nominate Chrissy.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm actually not interested right now.
Okay, that's fair. So right now we have Commissioner Faginello. Are there any other nominations? Okay, can we get a roll call vote, please?
All right, Evans.
Yes.
Rudder,
Yes.
Scrabble.
Yes.
Colbert,
Yes.
Frazier,
Yes.
Yoshida.
Yes.
And Bangamello.
Yes.
All right, great, perfect. So now we've got our chair and vice chair. I don't think we have to move around. I think we're in
Here we are.
our location, so that's convenient. The next item, unless there's any further discussion on that matter.
No,
No.
I think we're ready to proceed.
Okay, next item would be discussion of possible referral items to other boards in the city. Does anyone have anything related to that? All right, not this evening, that's okay. Do we have any other matters that are not listed on the agenda that we want to discuss?
I am curious about the calendar. Are we going to have a meeting on July 6th?
Well, that's what we wanted to talk about that at some point in the meetings. This is fine. We have a number of cases for July 20th that we're lining up, but none that will be ready for July 6th because of notice requirements and working with the applicants and so forth. So as soon as the moratorium ended, we got a little flood of applications, and we're now processing them, but none of them are going to be ready for July 6th. We thought that it's also kind of a holiday week, so it might be a good time to cancel and then just turn July 20th into a regular meeting rather than a study session and do the cases at that point. And there will be at least one that will be your first major adjustment case in the new residential code. And then we have a number that will go on consent as well. So we'll be sending all that information to you guys as soon as it's ready.
So I guess the question is, if there are a number of items on our agenda which include the consent agenda, it could potentially be a long evening.
If commission chooses to pull them off consent,
Okay,
that is true.
all right.
I know that the holiday is coming up, but I will actually be out of town on the 20th. They leave that morning, so.
Oh, okay.
All right, any other matters? Seeing none, I would take a motion to adjourn to study session.
Motion to adjourn to study session?
Second.
This is where everyone in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? All right, we are adjourned. Do we stay here or do we want to convene down there?
Try this.
I don't know. They might have an opinion.
Do y'all want us down there for a study session?
It's really up to you. We would have to move the tables and chairs. You're fine up there if you like.
It's fun.
Sure.
Okay. Be comfortable. Just a. Let's see where we're going. Let's try it again. We're trying to get the PowerPoint.
Which
up.
I'll email to all you guys too. So.
Last time.
Forest Tech helped me with this. It's city council. So now I know how to do it.
They used it for like 6 hearings, so they knew what they were
They're
doing.
like, I've got this.
Okay, so it's checked. It's launched. Are you any better at this, Stephanie?
Maybe.
If not,
Okay.
it's going to be nice to control it.
I know. We do have the. I'll go.
Instructions show up.
I'll go look for Monica's clicker as a backup.
Okay.
Because we could control it from here, but on this computer.
So, the instructions. Yep, that's your screen.
So then, how do I get the PowerPoint to show?
So just go to where, so pretty much anything that's on your screen is now going to show up.
Okay.
You have it figured out, right? 'Cause
May I
it's
ask
your
one
whole
thing
thing.
of everyone? If you know the score of the Avs game, please do not say it. 'Cause it's recorded at the house right now. It took a lot for me to come here.
I was surprised. I was impressed that everyone, I was like,
Oh, yeah. I mean, 20 years, like, it's been 21, I think, actually.
Something like that.
Thank you.
I know, right?
Just a quick announcement before we start the PowerPoint. This is Stephanie's last meeting with us.
It's been lovely working with you all. Yeah.
She's moving on.
I am.
We're very sad.
Yes.
Where are you going?
To Sunbelt Rentals. Yes, they're construction rental equipment. I'm doing some financial analysis for them.
Cool.
So very big change.
Are you sure you don't want to stay here and like have more 11 o'clock meetings?
A little late for my taste.
Thanks for all your hard work.
Yeah,
Thank
best of
you.
luck.
I'm gonna miss you.
Are we ready? Yeah. Well, for those of you who don't know me, I am Lori Strand, and I'm one of the city attorneys. I work for the firm of Michelle Cox and McCaskill, and we've been with Golden for a year now. So I did a planning commission training with Kathy Guckenberger, my colleague, last year, without knowing you guys or having done any meetings with you. So I've changed things around a little bit and kind of added some things that have kind of come up in conversation over the years. So hopefully it'll be informative to both the new members and the old members alike. So there's a lot of materials, and then at the end of it, Rick's going to talk about the interim site development plan procedures in the new zoning code form zones, and I can chime in because I tend to chime in if you know me. Okay, so the purpose of this training is really to introduce folks and to remind folks of broad principles. I've added a couple slides on open meetings, so we'll talk a little bit about open meetings and on zoning and land use law, and kind of the tools and considerations you need to keep at the forefront of your mind when you're making certain types of land use decisions. Most of your decisions are of a quasi-judicial matter, which we'll talk about. So there's kind of rules of conduct that as many of you are aware, that you kind of have to follow. So we're going to talk about those and spend a lot of time on that. And then, like I said, at the end, we're going to hit on the interim procedures that were just recently adopted, because we're going to be seeing them next month, it sounds like. So. And here's an outline. Some of these items I'm going to go through really quickly, and I'm of the viewpoint that PowerPoint presentations and slides, which I will send you, should be a useful document for you to go back to. So some of these slides have a lot of information as a reference for you to go back to, and we're not going to talk about everything that's in here, but it might be useful to you to have this document to look back at. So I won't go over this list, but these are things we're going to hit upon. These first two slides are one of those things. They're just really for your reference. And these are laws and rules that govern what you do. The Home Rule Charter, the Municipal Code. There's several sections in the Municipal Code. The Code of Ethics guides your behavior. We're going to hit upon the key provisions of the Code of Ethics in a little while. The last time I was here, I had thrown up on the board this floodplain variance appeal board, and I think somebody said, "What? We don't do that." So nothing to worry about. Again, this is informational. If we have something that comes up floodplain variance, we'll all read it and we'll figure it out. But again, this is just for information on all the places that Planning Commission kind of comes up in the Golden Code. Some of the big areas that you guys hit upon are subdivision plats, and several provisions in the zoning code. So that's Title 17 of the Municipal Code and Title 18 of the Municipal Code. Ordinance 2181, that is the ordinance that City Council just passed adopting the new form zoning for the residential districts, as well as mapping the residential districts. And in that ordinance itself, in that document itself, is the interim procedures that we're going to talk about. There's like a 180-day clock on those, and that clock is ticking right now. So while most things, when you adopt new text, new code, are added to the code, because these are interim procedures, it's actually in the ordinance document. So I know that Rick circulated that around in the email, but we'll go over that. So that's not going to, those provisions aren't going to be found in the code because they're temporary, but that's why that's listed up here. Planning Commission does have a set of bylaws and a set of rules of procedure, and I know that those were linked in the email from Rick as well. One of the things that we can talk about it maybe later in the evening, or I'll just give you a heads up right now. We think you can have a better set of bylaws and rules. I think these have been around for quite a while, and I don't think they are as helpful to you as they could be. And I think it's a bit unusual to have two separate sets of documents, and there's a lot of overlap. So one of the things that I've discussed with Rick is to introduce to you for discussion, perhaps next month we'll have to see how the schedule works out, a different set of bylaws and rules, a combined document that includes things like how do you vote for a chair and vice chair? So we don't have to look at Robert's Rules, which is listed up here. So if anybody's familiar with Robert's Rules, it's this parliamentary document that's very thick and written for several hundred parliamentary body on how you motion, how you amend motions, how you vote chairs, and currently your bylaws and rules reference those for us to take a look at if your bylaws and rules are silent, which is a bit unusual because City Council recommends that their boards and commissions not follow Robert's Rules, but follows a much easier document called Bob's Rules of Order. So there's some things that we're going to try to work to change. There's a City Council Board and Commissions Manual. This is something the city puts out. It's got some useful information for folks on all commissions. A lot of redundancy, but there are a couple of provisions that are unique. And then the City Council Rules of Procedure also hit upon what you guys can do when it comes to electronic participation. So that's another document. The reason I've put in bold 4 documents, because those are the 4 documents that I think it would be useful for the new members to read, and would be useful for the existing members, the prior members, to go back and read through again. I think all the other things that aren't in bold right now, as you get your staff reports, those will indicate where you want to go and look. So if you get a rezoning application, if you get a site development plan application, you'll get a staff report in your packet that says, look at Title 18, look at these sections. So, but again, I think reading what's in bold are things that are useful for the new members to take a look at and for the prior members to just refresh themselves on. With the caveat, the new bylaws and rules will hopefully be coming your way. Other laws out there, we're going to talk tonight about some constitutional provisions that kind of are the reasons why there's these rules of conduct for what you do. What you do affects people's property, so there are constitutional provisions both at the state level and the federal level that folks need to be aware of. We're going to talk briefly about open meetings law because I've had a bit of dialogue with folks over the course of the last year, and I think it would be helpful to everybody. I'm not going to talk about open records law, except to let folks know that your emails, if you're writing emails to staff, to sometimes other folks in the public, it depends, and it has to do with a public matter, just know that that email may be subject to open records law and to disclosure. So just, when you're writing, don't write something that you're worried might end up in the paper. So just keep that in mind, just a word to the wise. There's other statutes that come into play, but we're not going to hit upon those. Okay, I'm going to take a quick detour. This is to help make sense of these little interjections of what I'm doing here. But I wanted to talk real quickly about open meetings law for the benefit of the new members and just to kind of recap for everybody else. So Colorado open meetings law states that all meetings of 3 or more members of a local public body, which is defined to include the Planning Commission, at which public business is discussed or at which any formal action may be taken, are declared public meetings and open to the public at all times. Meeting is defined in the Act as any kind of gathering convened to discuss public business that's in person, by telephone, electronically, or by other means of communication. So what that really means, this meeting's obvious. This is a meeting. Open meetings law requires that meetings be properly noticed. But an email amongst 3 of you, or a text amongst 3 of you that discusses public business would constitute a meeting. So it's not appropriate to be having discussions of public business via text with 3 of you or via email with 3 of you because the public doesn't get an opportunity to participate in that conversation. Under open meetings law, a meeting does not include a chance meeting. If you guys run into each other, it's a small enough community that I'm sure that happens, or a social gathering, as long as the central purpose of that gathering isn't to discuss a public business. So it wouldn't be appropriate for 3 of you to attend a neighborhood meeting for a number of reasons, but one of them is that. There's no definition of public business. I think formal action is more intuitive for folks. We're voting to do something. We're voting to approve. We're voting to make a recommendation. That's more intuitive that that's a formal action. But this restriction on conversation amongst three of you also applies to public business. So the formation of any sort of public policy is public business, but there's no further definition of what it is in the law.
Can I ask a question on that?
Sure.
So, it makes a lot of sense in terms of, the neighborhood meetings and stuff that might eventually come to us, but if three of us have a common interest in, like, trying to think of something completely irrelevant to planning, like a park, like trying to get a new neighborhood park in a certain area, and we want to talk to Parks Board about it, and we are organizing among ourselves for something like that, that we would do even if we were independent of Planning Commission, like something that has absolutely nothing to do with planning.
I think in your example, if there were three of you that wanted to talk to the Parks Board, you should do it in open session, and get a quorum and get the position of the commission, right? And then there's a means to communicate that to the board in a formalized manner. But I think the idea is, again, the law is clear that you are a body, and if you're talking public business, and it's not defined as public business that only concerns the matters that come before you. And I think it's because you have a special role in the community, and you probably have special influence because of your role in the community. So if you're going to be having these conversations with three of you, you should be doing it out in the open. So I think if specific situations come up, we can have those conversations, but I think my initial recommendation, which is in bold here, is that I strongly recommend always erring on the side of discussing in a noticed meeting. So if there's a unique situation that comes up, we can talk about it and think it through.
I'm talking about like something that, what you said is come as with a commission recommendation, but if we are not commissioners, we're independent people, a different situation is if three of us happen to live in the same neighborhood and want council or MTAB to start permit parking in our neighborhood, which has nothing to do with Planning Commission, and we're doing it because we're neighbors, that kind of situation.
Again, I would want the actual facts to think about.
All right.
So my first position is don't do it until you talk about it, and let's talk about the specifics. You are members of a commission, but you don't leave your First Amendment rights at the door. You still have rights. So there are avenues for you to still participate as a member of the community, but perhaps three commissioners getting together to do that may not be appropriate, but specific situations we could look at more and research more. So, as I said, because public business is not fully defined, our firm strongly recommends that we err on the side of conducting discussions at noticed meetings. And that's because of what the courts have said and what the law itself says. So the courts interpret the act broadly to further the legislator's intent to give citizens a greater opportunity to meaningfully participate in decision making and to be fully informed about issues of public importance. The Colorado Supreme Court has also said that the act should be interpreted most favorably to protect the public. The law itself says that any person that's denied or threatened with the denial of any rights under the open meetings law has standing to sue the city. And if the city is found to be in violation, then the city is subject to litigation costs and attorney's fees. So these are the reasons why we err on the side of let's have conversations open at a meeting, and that's just our starting point. So specific situations we can look at. There's a lot of case law out there, so that could help guide us if there's specific situations. So the email between commissioners regarding scheduling or availability, hey, are you guys available for a special meeting next week? That's okay. An email sending out to folks saying, hey, here's something I'd like to discuss with folks later at a meeting. That's generally okay. And I put up here maybe okay. And the only reason I did that was because a couple years ago, the General Assembly added this language in open meetings law to say that city council members, that it's clear that email between city council members regarding scheduling and availability and to pose a question for later discussion is okay, which is really interesting that they said city council members, but they weren't talking about other types of local public bodies. So it's it's okay. Don't reply all and get in a big conversation and, you know, segue into other things. But it's just an interesting, I haven't researched the legislative history, but it's interesting that it says city council, but it doesn't say local public body there. So err on the side of caution. One question that came up with a former commissioner over the course of the last year, which was a really interesting one and turned out to be a very timely one, was, well, the law says, you know, 3 members can't talk, but what if I talk to Commissioner Bob, and then I talk to Commissioner Scrable, and then Commissioner Scrable talks to Commissioner Evans all about the same public business, and we're not all talking together? Is that okay? So that concept is known in the law as a serial meeting, and there's no precedential higher court decision in Colorado on this question. So when I was having this kind of dialogue with the former commissioner, you know, I was like, that sounds a little squishy to me because it kind of undermines this purpose of transparency and allowing the public to really understand the discussions that are going on. And then lo and behold, soon after we were having this exchange, a lower court, so this decision does not have any precedential value, but it is interesting, a lower court in Colorado did come out against 4 individual members of the Board of Education that were doing just that. And those were the facts, those were stipulated facts. They said, well, we weren't there, 3 of us were never meeting, 2 of us met, and then we talked to somebody else, and then we talked to somebody else. And so the court said, you're not allowed to do that. That violates the spirit of the law and the purpose of the statute, and they granted an injunction to prohibit any such further conversations. So again, that's a lower court, but it was really interesting. It was almost prophetic that we were having this conversation, and then within weeks, there's this lower court decision that came out. So I don't advise whipping of votes, essentially, going on behind the scenes in this body. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to your role, types of decision, rules of conduct. So I'm going to go through these next couple slides quickly. For the new members, again, you're going to get packets with staff reports with the action item that you're going to have to consider for that particular meeting. The staff report's going to say, take a look at this section of the code, and you're going to get kind of informed a little bit more as you go. No need to memorize all these things now, but you do a lot. This planning commission does a lot more than I've seen in other jurisdictions, but you're the recommending body on a large host of land use decisions, from rezonings to vacations. You just did a very large PUD and ODP, reapportionment of allocations under the residential growth management ordinance. I haven't played in that world yet, so that would be new to me whenever it comes down the pike, if it ever does. Certain types of subdivision approvals, you're the recommending body to city council. So you hear the matter and you make a recommendation to city council whether you think it should be approved or disapproved. You're also the final decision-making body on numerous land use decisions, including variances, special use permits, site development plans. You play a role in community landmarks, which I don't know that they come up very often. I think maybe one I've heard or something along those lines.
There might be one actually soon, but not very often.
There we go. So we'll revisit that together. So you play both functions as a recommending body to city council, and you also make the final decision on a number of items. And now, with the adoption of Ordinance 2181, you now are ratifying site development plan decisions for the next 6 months or so under the new form zoning. So you play a number of roles. We'll talk about that one a little bit more a little later. So when you're exercising these functions, as I said at the beginning, there are constitutional requirements for land use decision making, and there are 2 main provisions in both the United States Constitution and the Colorado Constitution that needs to be at the forefront of your minds. And the biggest one, and the one that we'll talk about the most tonight, is due process requirements. So the 5th Amendment to the United States Constitution states that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property, that's where you guys come in, without due process of law. The 5th Amendment to the United States Constitution is applicable to the state and applicable to you through the 14th Amendment. And then the Colorado Constitution has similar language, has identical language, but there's also a Colorado statute that goes even further about making sure that there isn't a regulatory impairment on property rights, and that due process is followed. At the state level, there's both constitutional provisions and state law. And that's the memo that I circulated around to you guys. That's what I'm referring to. So the essence of due process, when you're thinking land use decision making, is really procedural due process. And what we'll talk about more is that you need to make sure that the applicant is provided adequate notice of what is going to be expected of them, what is required for them to get your approval. They are entitled to a fair hearing before neutral, impartial decision makers. So that's where the rules of conduct that we're going to talk about kind of come from, this essence of procedural due process. Also at play is takings law, and I think people just hear about this a lot more, and this is the sort of thing you hear in the papers now and then. So the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution also says, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. The Colorado Constitution goes a bit farther and says private property shall not be taken or damaged for public or private use without just compensation. And again, Colorado state law, which does apply to the city of Golden, also goes further in having regulatory provisions to kind of make sure that takings do not occur. So the essence of takings law is that it prevents local governments from requiring individuals to bear public burdens that should be borne by the public at large. And an example is, if there's a project and there's a traffic study that says this project is not going to have any impacts on traffic, and there's a bridge that's needed a block away, the city can't say, hey developer, you've got a lot of money, we'll approve your project if you build us this bridge. You're not allowed to do that because the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution doesn't let you, nor does the Colorado Constitution. So we talked about that you're a recommending body, that you make decisions, and those recommendations and decisions are characterized as either legislative in nature or quasi-judicial in nature. And I know a lot of folks have heard this a number of times, but whether or not a matter is legislative or quasi-judicial is what determines the amount of due process that is owed to the applicant, or that you must afford folks in your process. So legislative matters, you're not the legislative body, but you do make recommendations on a number of legislative matters to City Council. Legislative matters, involve determinations of public health, safety, welfare. They're forward-thinking. It concerns the community interest. It's not focused on an individual or an individual piece of property. It's the making of laws. It's those kind of larger, prospective type decisions. Examples of legislative matters that you're involved with is you make recommendations on text amendments to the subdivision code and the zoning code. Comprehensive plan, you guys play a very big role in comprehensive plan adoption and updates, and comprehensive plans establish the vision and the policy over a long time horizon, 20, 30 years, and so you play a very large role in that. But those types of recommendations and decisions don't affect a specific piece of property or a handful of properties or individuals. It's much broader based. Same thing for large scale or citywide rezonings. When the city was mapped in form zoning a couple of weeks ago, it was the residential zone districts. It wasn't the entire city, but it was a large portion of the city that was legislative in nature. So those are legislative. Quasi-judicial matters is a lot of what you do. It's most of what you do. Those are things like rezonings. You make recommendations on rezonings of individual properties or maybe a collection of a couple properties. Approvals of PUDs that affect specific owners and specific properties, site development plans, special use permits, variances, those are all, they affect individual property owners or maybe a small couple of property owners. So it used to be the Colorado Supreme Court said, well, in order for something to be quasi-judicial, 3 things have to be in place. There needs to be a code requirement for adequate notice to the public before the Planning Commission makes its recommendation or decision. The code has to require a public hearing pursuant to that notice, at which time citizens must be given the opportunity to be heard and present evidence. And the third thing is that the code has to require that you, the commission, and later on city council, if you're recommending body, makes your decision based on code requirements, code standards. So that's the old test. And that would have resulted in a narrower body of decisions, because not all of the items that come before you require a public hearing, for example. Some might just require a public meeting, which folks might not know the difference, but that means that the community and public meetings there isn't a public comment period, where in a hearing there is. So in the old test, that would kind of put one in a different category. Under the current test, which was a different Supreme Court decision from Colorado, that came out in 1988, said there's no litmus test. And what you really need to think about is you need to focus on the nature of the decision and the process to reach the decision. And it's really those things I was already emphasizing, that it's reasonable certainty that what you're doing is quasi-judicial in nature, if your decision or your recommendation is going to affect specific individuals, and that, again, this is from the old test too, that you're required to make that decision based on code requirements. Applying facts that are presented to you, and you apply them, and then you make your decision. So you're acting like a judge. So that's quasi-judicial, that's legislative. So what process is due? Depending on if an item is legislative, text amendment recommendation, comprehensive plan, there's great deference that's given to yourselves and city council with those recommendations and those decisions. You're really just not supposed to act at a whim, arbitrarily. You should consider things like the city's policies that have already been adopted, the comprehensive plan, neighborhood plans, Golden Vision 2030. You should take into consideration the public health, safety, and welfare, but really it's a broad brush. There aren't these specific standards that you need to be looking at to say, oh, this comprehensive plan amendment makes sense. You don't have that same kind of specific criteria that you need to apply. Rules of conduct, what are you allowed to do vis-a-vis the public, and what are you allowed to base your decision on? And it's open when it comes to legislative matters. You're allowed to lobby, and you're allowed to be lobbied. You're allowed to talk to your cashier about what they think about what's being considered for the comprehensive plan. You're allowed to talk to your neighbor about, form zoning. You're allowed to have those conversations. And you can have a personal policy perspective, so a bit different. I just want to highlight here is that you still need to comply with open meetings law. So you guys can't be three of you talking together, outside the confines of a public meeting. So while you can lobby and be lobbied, you shouldn't be doing it to each other. You should save that to the meeting. So that sometimes might get lost. So for quasi-judicial matters, and this is where we're going to spend the rest of our conversation, there's more rules that you have to follow. So the reason it's called quasi-judicial is because you're kind of, not entirely, acting like a judge. And people's property rights that are protected under the Fifth Amendment and protected against takings law and due process are at play. So for quasi-judicial matters, what process is due? The parties have a right to present witnesses and evidence. The applicant who's applying for your approval or your recommendation of approval on something has the burden of persuading you that the standards of approval for that particular application have been met. The applicant also has the right of rebuttal. So most folks up here know, but the way these usually run, staff does a presentation about an application, then the applicant presents the presentation, then there's some question and answer to kind of clarify what's being requested. There's a public comment period, and after all that happens, the applicant gets a right to rebuttal. They get to respond to things that were said, because this is similar to, like I said, similar to a court. They have those rights. It is quasi, however. This is not a court. There's no rules of evidence in the way that there's a court. Hearsay, which I studied only to take the bar exam, is a statement made outside a hearing that's offered as a proof of an assertion made in a hearing. That's not okay in court. It is okay here. So this is not a court in that regard. So the rules of conduct for quasi-judicial matters, like we said, which is a lot, most of what you do, is that you need to avoid ex parte contacts. If you were a judge, you wouldn't be allowed to talk to the parties, you wouldn't be allowed to talk to the jury, you wouldn't be able to talk to the witnesses or the members of the public. Avoid ex parte contacts. We'll talk about that more in a second. You're required to be impartial, fair, unbiased, and avoid prejudgment. You're supposed to make your decision based on what's presented to you and the staff materials that's provided to you, which includes applicant packet materials, staff's analysis, and during the hearing. That's what you're supposed to. You're not supposed to judge on anything else outside of that realm. And you're supposed to avoid conflicts of interest. So early on, I kind of emboldened several materials that I thought, 4 materials that I thought would be helpful for you to read. And one of them is the Code of Ethics that's in the code, and that talks about and defines conflicts of interest. And I have some meaty slides with that material here as well.
Can I interrupt? Ask
Sure.
a question? On the hearsay aspect of things, since we can't.
I just told you, I just studied that for the bar exam 20 years ago.
Of course, that's where I'm going to ask the question. So it's an in practice question, right? I mean, it's there's no organization that precludes that from
Right.
the applicant making that part of the record. Any advice on what role it takes in decision making? I mean, we hear it, but yeah.
So it's the Planning Commission's role to really weigh what they feel is credible evidence and how much weight to give. So, if somebody came up and a member of the public testified and said, here are my thoughts, and my neighbor, Bob Smith, agrees with me, right? So that would be hearsay in a court. But if they said, 5 of my neighbors couldn't get here, we really don't like this, and, Thank you for your comment. Please have them send in comment. That would be great if they can come next time. But you can kind of weigh that and judge that. But it's not going to overturn a decision because you've kind of taken that information. That happened recently in one of your hearings. Somebody said, "Oh, they had to leave early tonight." I think that happened a couple times. They had to leave early tonight. They were here in support. You weigh it how you think's appropriate.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so I'm going to do another quick sidebar because this is something that's come up a lot over the years, and I just said this, but I want to say it again, is on the city staff versus the applicant's responsibilities when it comes to these kind of quasi-judicial land use applications. So the city staff's responsibilities, they administer the land use process. They provide the application requirements to the applicants. They answer questions of the applicants. They answer questions of the public about pending projects. They answer questions that you field to them. They determine whether an application is complete or not. Where it's appropriate, such as in the PUD context, they might negotiate with the applicant. In other places, it's not as appropriate. The code requirements are much more objective, and it's not really that discretionary realm. The staff is responsible for getting referrals out, for coordinating with other departments. If feedback from other boards is required or helpful, that's staff's role. They're responsible for overseeing noticing requirements, making sure the applicant knows what they are. So for new members, noticing requirements are, does the property need to be posted? Does a neighborhood meeting need to be held and that be noticed? Does there need to be a published notice, written notice to the neighbors? And they're responsible for preparing a staff report to provide to the commission and later on to city council. And that staff report is intended to summarize the project, to identify any main issues that maybe came out in their review, how those were handled or not handled, and to analyze, to identify for you what code criteria apply, what are the approval criteria, and staff's take on those approval criteria. So that's their role. The applicant, again, I can't underscore this enough, the applicant bears the burden of proof. If they're asking for your approval for any of the land use type applications that I listed, they're the ones who are asking for approval. It's they're responsible for demonstrating that what they're presenting to you conforms with all the code criteria. So it's come up a couple times because sometimes you guys get a lot of materials on whether or not staff can weed it out or direct you guys to what's the most important thing we should be reading here. That's not really staff's role. That is precisely your role, is to review the materials that are presented to you and kind of sift through what you think is germane to determining whether or not the approval criteria are met. So while staff works hard, I've observed some of them, and I'll grab you. to help applicants understand the criteria and to provide them some guidance on things that you would be most interested in, and maybe not showing a pretty picture when they're just asking for a rezoning. If the applicant goes ahead and submits it, that's their purview, and it's their purview to establish their record, which they think. So staff can help try to direct them, but if they want to show you a pretty picture, even though you're just approving a rezoning, just know that you're not approving the pretty picture, right? That's not guaranteed. So go for it.
Yeah, and it's kind of between this and what was on the previous slide with regards to staff's role, because he talked about they field questions from us. Mm-hmm. And I guess my question is like, what should our expectation be in terms of responses from staff? Are they going to, and it'll probably vary from depending on what the question is, what the case is, and what have you, but is there a general
well, we can both, I guess, answer what, so I think, so just, and we'll talk about this, so, on the one hand, this is a quasi-judicial decision, so if you have, a very specific question about something and it's really easy to answer, it's staff's responsibility to make sure that they say, so-and-so asked me this question, here's the answer, so everybody gets that information. Yeah. And so that it's in the packet of materials that's available to the public, so everybody's on the same playing field. If it's kind of broader based, I'd like you to give this some thought, I'm going to have some questions about this, it's more giving them the heads up. Yeah. And that's, not getting a response via, let's send this back out as a supplement to the packet. Now it's, okay, thanks, you've just let us know that you want us to discuss this and be prepared to discuss this, and then they'll be prepared. And I know that they're very grateful when they get a heads up that there might be a meaty conversation about something.
No, that's very true. And I know that in the past, especially, the more seasoned planning commissioners are used to an era where we actually would send out, commissioners would ask questions and then we would sort of broadcast the answer to through email to the group. And I think that's a practice that we're getting away from now. So it's more about teeing it up for the actual hearing process than it is getting an answer prior to the hearing.
Got it. Perfect. That's helpful. Thank you.
So can I ask a question on the applicant responsibility and stuff? Where's the responsibility to make sure that the applicant gives us true and accurate information?
It is the commission's role to judge whether there's credible evidence presented to them. But this is where the quasi comes in. It is not the commission's role to cross-examine and prove people wrong. And I know we've had this conversation for seasoned commissioners, but I think that, and I know that there's been frustration, and I acknowledge that there's frustration with this response, that it really does come back to the approval criteria. So I know that we've gone sideways on some conversations about matters that commissioners didn't think that this piece of the information provided to us is not factually true, and I know it's not factually true. And I think you have to think about it as a body. If you think that's not true, and that leads you to the conclusion that one of the criteria is not met, then that's really important. But if there's just this thing that's just bothering you, but the criteria are otherwise met, I don't think you should be going down that rabbit hole. So again, it's not staff's obligation to fact check every statement in applicant narration, right? I mean, that's not the role that you play. It's the application is complete. Have you if it's a site plan, it's much more objective. Does what's on the site plan objectively meet this criteria? But if there's a narrative or an applicant's written statement that's just this is who we are, this is what we've done in the past, this is what our company is. I don't know that fact checking is really staff's role in that regard.
Sorry, yes, I know exactly what you're talking about, but my question is probably a little bit broader in terms of actual fact. We had one case years ago where an applicant tried to claim that 47% was greater than 50% and getting points on the sustainability menu.
I don't remember this. This is
I can't remember which applicant it was, but they the 50% had to be under. They wanted 50% of parking had to be under something to get some points, and they were claiming that 47% was was greater than 50, and so that was bringing them over the sustainability points. And our former city attorney, like when we brought this up, he said, "Well, how do you know that 47 isn't greater than 50?" It was.
It's the new math.
It was what I'm hearing you say is we have discretion in what we give credibility to, and in that situation we can use.
Yes, and I think that so. Yes, you have yes 47, and I don't know the specifics of obviously of that situation, but more generally in your example, it sounds like if you weren't satisfied that they demonstrated 50% and getting that finding was necessary to meet the sustainability requirement, you can find noncompliance. And when you find noncompliance, you say, we do not find that the sustainability criteria has been met, and here's the reason why. And if there's, and we'll get to this at the end on challenges, if this was the final decision, like for a site development plan, where it's appealable to court, the court's going to look at the record, and they're going to say, they're going to defer to your judgment, and they're going to look to see, one, did you act arbitrarily or capriciously, and two, is there one iota, I can't remember the exact language in that, but it's very deferential, is there evidence to support your decision? So that speaks to the criteria. What I've kind of observed, and I want to caution folks against, is not going down the rabbit hole on finding things wrong with an application that aren't germane to the criteria. And again, if there's a narrative or if there's a picture that's shown, there's no need to go, just really try to get back to something like that. Like there's a 50% requirement. This looks like 47%. Persuade me why it's not. And if it's not, if you're not persuaded, then you make the finding of noncompliance, and that's why.
Okay. So. And on cases like that, and I think I know what you're going to say, but I'm going to bring it up anyway. There have been cases in the past where commission has given deference to the applicant based on what they say in the hearing, and what actually happens is not what they say in the hearing, and how in the future, like on future hearings, are we allowed to bring up the applicant's past history of not being credible in terms of it, and not being totally truthful?
That's interesting, because in your subdivision code, there's a language in the code that provides kind of like relief from providing a 100% performance guarantee for folks that have performed, and like there is language in that regard. I think if the situation comes up, we'd have to look at it, and we'd have to look at the criteria. But again, you're stuck with the criteria, and I think that if it's a site development plan, again, I think that or a plat, I think it's easy, it's objective, and so if they say during the hearing, we're going to paint this blue, and that's not on the plan. And you didn't say, well, you agreed to painting it blue as a voluntary condition, and that's actually what's added as a condition, then that's not what's approved, right? So there's some dots that need to be connected, and so I get help with that to connect those dots. But again, you're approving the plan. So if they don't comply with the plan, then they're in violation of zoning. If they said, I'm going to paint it blue, and they didn't paint it blue, they're not in violation of anything, unless you said, well, you voluntarily agreed to the condition to paint it blue, right? And that's actually part of the approval. So we can help connect those dots if similar situations, and if there's a bad actor that comes up, we can take a closer look. But no, I don't think a representation that was made and you had different expectations, but they complied with the actual approval, gives you grounds to
So I
think what it gives you is the incentive to say, well, you voluntarily agree to this as a condition, right? Because yes, we don't trust you, right?
I think that's what we're getting to, is like, if it's important, and if they're saying it, and if they're not willing to commit to it in a voluntary commitment in the language of the resolution, then we can't consider it as
no, you can't. And when you're asking for it, it should relate to the criteria, right? So it's not just because you want it. Right. So if you're like, I'm struggling to find compliance with this, but I could get there if you painted it blue, will you paint it blue? But not just because, I'd really like this. So we've kind of had these conversations a couple times. So, but yeah, so good questions. So, okay. So that was a sidebar. So now I'm back. So rules of conduct, we're talking about quasi-judicial matters. These are your rezonings, your SDPs, your plats, your special use permits, a lot of what you do. So rule of conduct number 1, as we said, avoid ex parte contacts. What are they? They're any sort of oral or written communications outside of the hearing between you and an applicant, a council member, or a member of the public. So don't have them. What do you do if you have them? Well, these are going to happen. It's a small community. You're going to see people. They know you. They see you on TV. Hi, everybody. Undoubtedly, you're going to come across a situation where somebody asks you about something that's either before you, coming down the pike that might come before you. So if that happens, we like to recommend that you're just ready, you're prepared. And so a good response is, I would love to hear what you'd like to say. I know the commission would love to hear what you'd like to say. Here's the staff person that's working on that. Here's Rick's information. Reach out to them, send in written comments, come to the meeting. And that's what you do. If you get an email, forward it to Rick, forward it to Lauren, and they will make sure that it's included in the packet and sent out to everybody. So again, you can respond, and I know this has happened a couple times this year to 3 or 4 of you. It's not uncommon for this to happen. And same thing, just have your script ready. Thanks for reaching out. I'd like to hear from you. The commission would like to hear from you. Submit written comments to everybody. Come to the meeting, talk to staff. But you shouldn't engage in those conversations. Let's see. Also, so ex parte, like I said, it happens all the time, but it's one of these that can be cured. And there's really recent case law to support what seemed like a really egregious ex parte contact happening with a councilwoman in Denver. And she went up there on the dais and she said, I have been contacted by all of these people, and I told them that I can't speak to them, and I feel that I can make a decision based on the information that's provided to me tonight at the hearing. So disclose. So if somebody has reached out to you via email or your cashier or your neighbor, disclose it at the beginning of the meeting, say how you handled it, then it's on the record, and we're good. This is, I know we highlighted this last time, but I'll highlight it again, that even after conclusion of a planning commission public hearing, you shouldn't be talking about things until the appeals period has run, if you're final decision maker, which is generally 28 days. And you shouldn't be talking about something that you've just made a recommendation on until after the appeals period has run, after council's decision. So we're not going to talk about it substantively, but Course Tech is an obvious example. Council recently made a decision. We're currently in the 28-day appeals period, 30-day referendum period. So it's just good practice not to talk about it until it's kind of final, right? One of the reasons, particularly with City Council, is that City Council could remand something back to you. So if you've made a recommendation, you send it up to City Council, and it might come back to you. It's not good practice to be having conversations out there with the public or the applicant or whomever until you there's a point of finality. So rule of conduct number 2 for quasi-judicial matters, again, be impartial, fair, don't be biased, avoid prejudgment. So I have in these materials, and I went through them last time for the seasoned commissioners, kind of some case examples, and there's enough kind of language written on the slide for folks to read. But there's one case where this actually happened. Don't sign a pro or con statement. So if a rezoning's coming before you or a site development plan's coming before you, and your neighbor knocks on your door and says, can you sign this, that you're opposed to this project? Don't do it. Don't sign anything. That shows prejudgment, right? I've highlighted this. Don't make up your mind before the hearing or during the hearing, prior to hearing all evidence. I highlighted this because this is kind of something that I've tried to interrupt and kind of dissuade folks from doing, is that during a hearing, I think it's easy for us to think, don't come to the table and make up your mind before the hearing, but during the hearing, try not to either. And particularly try not to express things on the record as if you've already made up your mind before the hearing is you're in the deliberation stage. So again, staff presents, applicant presents, after it, then there's a question and answer session. It's not a good idea during that question and answer session to start drawing conclusions on what you've heard. You're only halfway through the process, right? There's still public comments, there's still an applicant rebuttal. So kind of withhold those kind of drawing conclusions until you get to the deliberation stage of the hearing. So I've interrupted before, I'll interrupt again, but I thought that was just one to highlight because, like I said, it's easy to say don't come to the hearing, have your mind made up, but don't make up your mind until you've heard anything. And certainly don't state, early on in a hearing, well, this is just ridiculous. I don't even, so be careful. Don't conduct your own discovery or investigations. Don't Google. Don't Google on your phone when you're up there and say, oh, wait a second. Again, you're like a judge, so you have to, you gotta focus on what's being presented to you, and that's what you're making your decisions on. Don't attend neighborhood meetings. Neighborhood meetings are a preliminary step in a lot of these processes. They're eventually going to come to you. You shouldn't be hearing what's presented there. They're also very preliminary, and it's really just an early formulation. So it really could create a sense of bias or false expectations. So it's just a bad idea altogether. One of the case examples that you'll see when I send this out, that's what happened. Somebody attended a neighborhood meeting. Avoid social media chatter. Avoid reading it and engaging in it. So, next door, people love it or hate it, but, reading it is, if you're reading it on a project that might come before you, you're getting that outside information, so you should avoid that as well. Okay, so rule of conduct number 3, avoid conflicts of interest. Why? Because it gives rise to claims of partiality, bias, and prejudgment, things we just talked about. And it's really important to assure public confidence in city government. If you have a conflict, we'll talk about what those are under the code in a minute, but if you have a conflict, it's better to recuse yourself and not participate so that folks have faith and trust in city government and their representatives. This is particularly true where you have discretion, and you have a fair amount of discretion for a number of your decisions or recommendations. Okay, so there's a lot on here, but I think it's 2-3 pages. This is pulled directly from the Code of Ethics, provisions that apply to city officials. There's different provisions that say city council members, but so when you're reading through, it's like 7 or 8 pages, kind of hone in on where it says city officials, because that's who you are. So the Code of Ethics prohibit you from participating in an official action if you have a financial interest in the matter that's before the body, or you have any sort of interest in the business entity that's represented or affiliated with an applicant, whether or not they're paid or unpaid. An official action is a vote, a decision, an advisory opinion, or a recommendation. It's whatever you do. A financial interest is a pecuniary interest, and it includes if somebody in your immediate family, and that's defined in the code, but has a financial interest as well. Don't solicit or accept any present or future gift or service or thing of value that would lead a reasonable person to believe that you've been kind of persuaded or influenced unduly. Obvious things, but they're there, and again, you should read the code. That's the same thing, that first bullet, so that saves you some reading. You shouldn't engage or accept private employment or render service for financial, private, or personal interest when doing so conflicts with your official duties or would impair your judgment. A lot of these things seem kind of overlapping and redundant, but just be aware. A personal and private interest, I have that definition written down. It means a benefit, advantage, or right of, or pertaining to, or peculiar to a certain individual. So if you might be benefited in some way in a peculiar manner that's not common to others, you may want to think about whether or not it's appropriate for you to participate. You shouldn't appear on behalf of any private person, business, or entity before the commission or city council, or any of the other, public bodies in Golden, except for yourself, your spouse, or minor children. And that's again because there's an appearance of impropriety, that you have undue influence since you work together so closely, you know, the city council members, so you shouldn't be appearing on behalf of anybody unless it's your spouse or kids. So what do you do if you think you have a conflict, whether it's personal, financial? You know, just check in with me as soon as you think so. I know, you know, folks sometimes are like, oh, this is my neighbor. That's not necessarily a conflict, but you know, you can reach out to me, you can reach out to Rick. You know, I think we fielded a lot of these questions, so we're usually on the same page so far. So, so the Golden Code of Ethics, what it says that you're supposed to do. So if you do have a financial interest, a personal interest, or a private interest in any matter that's coming before you, you should disclose the interest to the commission by written notice to the city manager and the commission. You should not vote on the matter. There are some exceptions where a quorum's needed, and then there's some exceptions to allow you to vote, but that has never happened in my experience, although we were close at one time in a different jurisdiction. You're also required to refrain from influencing or attempting to influence decisions of other members of the body. So for that reason, you're told not to attend the public meetings. So again, if you have a financial, personal, or private interest as defined in the code, you're not supposed to influence people, which includes going to the meeting. If you have a potential but not an actual conflict where you're just like, maybe this might just look or feel weird, what we always recommend, and a number of you have already done it and have done a great job of doing it, even more, you know, more broadly than I would even, you guys do a great job of this, is that you disclose at the beginning of the meeting what you think might be squishy, and you just state for the record that you feel comfortable that you can make a fair decision despite what the situation is based on the evidence that's presented to you. So it's on the record. Stating things on the record is always a great way to kind of clear the air.
Can I ask one question? Sure. You said that there can be an exception to the no voting if there's
an issue with quorum.
So I'm just trying to understand the logic on that. Does the conflict of interest doesn't go away if there is not a quorum? So
but you need a quorum for the body to act. So that's just what state and golden law says.
So if you have like a blatant, glaring conflict of interest, but there's not a quorum, you can still participate?
That's what the law says. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
But there's disclosures and there's filings with the Secretary of the State, so there's procedural components. So
it'll make
the record is
complicated, but we can do it.
Yeah. So except it is permissible to vote if officials' participation is necessary to establish a quorum or otherwise enable the body to act, but only if written disclosure is made to the Colorado Secretary of State per Colorado statutes and to the public body. That record of such disclosure will it'll be kept as a record and it'll be captured in the minutes as well. So it's provided in state law and in city law because a body can't act without quorum. So again, I've never seen it happen. I've seen it almost happen one time. And you guys, it's even less likely to happen because you have an alternate. So so the chances
is 4. Quorum for us is 4.
Yeah. Do you have anything where you require like a? Sometimes they're like the super majority, but I don't think you guys have any.
I don't think there is anything that would require that. No.
Sometimes the Board of Adjustment, and you guys don't have a Board of Adjustment, but you serve that function as a vote of 4 of a 5-member body, but you guys are a 7-member body, so I don't think there's those situations. So what are the risks of not following the rules of conduct for quasi-judicial matters? A potential invalidation of your decision if you're the final decision maker, or a council decision if you were the recommending body. You could subject the city to potential liability for violating applicants' constitutional rights. Again, we're talking about due process and property rights under the state and U.S. Constitution. We'll talk in a few minutes about, you know, there's supposed to be one avenue for review, which is supposed to be a very quick on-the-record review. But very often, if somebody is challenging a land use decision, you will see constitutional claims tacked on, and those could be quite costly. They include attorney's fees, lost staff time, lost attorney time. So it's not a good place to be. There's also some risk to losing immunities that are afforded you under common law and the Governmental Immunity Act. So following the rules of conduct is important to you as an individual, to the city, to the commission. So keep those things in mind. If you're ever concerned, reach out to us. This is the same as last time, but for the benefit of folks, there's just some general tips for meetings and decision making. Some of this is captured in the City Council Board Manual. So there's some sections that this is kind of pulled from or conceptually pulled from. A reminder that you are a collective decision-making body. A commissioner does not act, the commission acts. It's not appropriate for you to go out there in the community and express your individual views as if they're the views of the commission. You need to have permission from the commission to speak on their behalf. A good example is when the Sustainability Board, they gave one of their members permission to speak on their behalf at one of your recent hearings. So that would be a similar thing that you could do, but the body has to give you that permission. These are general rules. These are captured in your rules and bylaws and will still be captured in the new set that we'd like to draft. To use and expect civility in meetings, to set the tone. A lot of this comes down to the chair to make sure that happens. To maintain a degree of formality. To refer to each other as, Commissioner Colbert, Commissioner Rutter. I'm not always great at this. I like the informality, but it does kind of, it helps, just express that you're doing an important job out here to the community. Madam Chair, things along those lines. When you're up here, not having side discussions and whispering, not looking at your phone. Deliberations are really important. We'll talk about a record in a second. So I know I've had a conversation with Patty about this, and I think this language comes from CIRSA's guide on, I said Patty, Commissioner Evans, about this. The idea is that it's really important for you guys to deliberate after you've heard the applicant, after you've heard staff, after you've heard the public, to get your ideas out there. It's not a debate. You're not supposed to be fighting with one another and debating with one another, but you are supposed to discuss your different positions. But at a certain point, you motion and you make a decision, and that's the voice. That's the one voice. That's the act of the body. If there's a legal challenge, the judge will review the record. They get a transcript of the record. So the deliberations, it's not often that you actually walk through the criteria. We've done it recently, and that was really great. But, that's not normally what happens. But you can kind of glean from deliberations that you're making your decision based on approval criteria. So it's important to kind of deliberate and make sure you're talking about the right criteria. Already said it's not supposed to be a debate.
Can I?
Sure.
Sorry, and I think it was a good opportunity because I kind of wanted to bring this up anyway, but in terms of making sure that we're all on the same page with how to conduct ourselves during a hearing, like we don't want to interrupt each other, and I'll call on people, you kind of, raise your hand, I'll make sure to look around, make sure that everyone's getting a chance to speak, but we want to make sure that, like you said, that we are, being respectful of each other, but also of the public, and making sure that we are able to communicate what we're trying to get across. And, like I said, we'll make sure everyone has a chance to speak, but we want to make sure that we're not interrupting each other and that we're being pretty formal. I think study session's a little different. I think the established procedure that I was brought in on was we can use first names in study session, but in public hearing, we want to be a little bit more formal and refer to each other as commissioner. So I think it just sets the stage as something a little bit more, formal. So I don't know. Is that okay with everyone? Agree? Cool. All right.
No, that's great. And just to underscore another really important reason for everybody to kind of one person at a time speak is because when there is a transcript and somebody's transcribing it, there's not, folks speaking on top of each other, and that record is really important if we were to have a 106A4 challenge. So we'll talk about that. So taking action, typically the chair will call for a motion and a second, and then there'll be some discussion. As Chair Rutter said, she'll give each individual member an opportunity to speak if they'd like to, and then a vote will be taken. Again, when you're taking action, you should be taking action based on the approval criteria, facts that are presented to you during the hearing and in the packet materials. And there are generally 3 things you can do, and this is either you're making a recommendation or you're making a decision to approve if the applicant demonstrates compliance with the criteria, and the facts that are presented to you in the staff report and otherwise demonstrate that the criteria are met, you are obligated to approve without conditions. Even if you don't like the criteria, even if you don't like the applicant, that's your role, is to apply the criteria to the facts. I shot a memo around. You do have authority to approve with conditions in theory. Conditions are tricky. And this goes to due process and to takings law, that if an applicant, you shouldn't be asking for conditions unless you need that condition to get to a finding of compliance with the criteria. It's not, oh, I want this too. If an applicant voluntarily agrees to a condition, fair game, we'll add it to the resolution. If it goes on to ordinance, we'll make sure it's carried forward in the ordinance. That's what we did with CoreStack. Or you can impose a condition if there's clear authority in the code and it's specific enough to put the applicant on notice that they might be subject to such a condition. And there's not a lot of those. Where this mostly comes up and where it is captured in the code is where there might be an exaction for property or an in lieu fee, and those are things that are spelled out in the code. So there are very few circumstances in the code as it's currently written for you to impose involuntary conditions. But as each application comes through, I'll do a scan for that. I'll read the code provisions and seeing if there's any sort of authority there. But again, in my observation so far, it's kind of narrow. If an applicant, fails to demonstrate compliance or is unwilling to voluntarily agree to a condition because you don't have the authority to impose it, then you've got to deny. So even if you really like the project, but it doesn't meet the criteria, just like you're obligated to approve if it does, you're obligated to deny if it doesn't. City Council has adopted the criteria, and you guys are bound to apply them to the facts. So those are the actions. This is my last slide. So, and the score right now is. So I spoke briefly about it. For quasi-judicial decisions, there is a procedure that's set out in the Colorado Rules of Civil Procedure. It's known as a 106 appeal out there in the legal world, and it is an on-the-record appeal that can be made of any final quasi-judicial decision. So it wouldn't be any of your recommendations, or it's not supposed to be. I have seen lawsuits where folks try to appeal a recommendation unsuccessfully, but it's final decision. So if you are a final decision maker, it's generally appealable through this process. If City Council is the final decision maker and you've made a recommendation, it's appealable through this process. It has to be filed within 28 days of the final decision, and it's set out to where a court, it's not a jury trial, it's not oral argument, it's an on-the-record appeal. So your transcripts, staff materials, anything that you saw, anything the council saw would be the record, and the court will look only at that record and determine, it's quite deferential, whether or not there is any competent evidence to support the decision. So if you said denied because 47 is not greater than 50 and here's why, they would look to say, was there competent evidence for you to determine that 47 is not greater than 50? And then they'll also look at whether you've acted arbitrarily or capriciously. And a third thing that's not on here is that they'll make sure that you followed your procedure. And that's really where staff plays a really big role in making sure things are properly noticed. Is a really big one, if there's a required neighborhood meeting. So did you check all the dots? So that's what a court's going to look like. It's supposed to be, like I said, the exclusive remedy, but in practice, I have not often seen an appeal of a land use decision that is limited to a 106. Litigators are litigators, and they often tack on constitutional type claims of you violated my due process under the Colorado and U.S. Constitution. It's a taking. People like throwing out the word taking. Equal protection. You're treating me different than other folks. And declaratory judgment claims. So it's supposed to be the exclusive remedy, but when you find yourself in litigation, we'll often find ourselves trying to get those other claims dismissed, and so you really get kind of caught up in the weeds. The real point of highlighting and having this is that it's really important to establish the record. Again, the most important thing is to keep coming back to the criteria. keep coming back to, what are the 3, 4, 5 things that you're supposed to base your decision on. That's what you need to be thinking about. That's what you need to be discussing. Your questions should be directed towards coming to a conclusion on those matters, not other things. Legislative matters, different story entirely, but for quasi-judicial, your questions, your deliberations, your decisions should really be based on how the facts lead you to believe that those specific criteria in the code have been met or not. So, like I said, for folks, there are some kind of summaries of a couple of cases of things that have gone wrong, of examples of people that ex parte, conflict, things like that. So they're in there. I'll send this around to you guys tomorrow, and I'm around for questions. But I know we've got a couple more slides.
I have a question for you.
Okay.
One of the things that comes up over the years is the question of precedent. And do any of the decisions you all make in, say, land use cases establish some sort of precedent that then carries over into some future decision-making process? And maybe you could address.
I would say no and yes. So I would say, if you have two very similar variance requests, they're adjacent properties, they're the same size property, they're the same slope, all these things are the same, and you approve a setback variance for one and not the other. And the one neighbor, has a really savvy and great attorney who is presenting and knows that their neighbor got one a month before, and they say, here is my property, here's my neighbor's property, here for the record is a copy of your decision in that case, I want the same thing. And then if you guys just say no, and you don't discuss why the facts in this case are, don't meet the criteria, well then there might be something in the record to establish arbitrariness, right? So that's it might. But I think that as long as you are applying the facts are different. If facts are identical and somebody presents in the record that the same facts were presented to you before and you come to a different decision, there might be an argument for arbitrariness, depends. But I think, on a general principle, when you write down a decision, it's not like you're bound to the same thing because facts are different. Mm-hmm.
In that example, that example will never happen. There are always changes, but in that example, say if the one that we approved it because they were committing to some affordable housing piece of it, or they were committing to greater sustainability, but the one that we denied was not. Is that enough difference of the arbitrary?
If it's properly related to the criteria and the explanation, right? I don't think you have any, or perhaps you do. I don't know. For affordable housing, you have some sort of bonus type provision. So again, I think that, and facts are different if these things come up. I'll look at them differently, but I'm going to give the same general advice, is that as long as you are making your decision on the facts that are presented and you're analyzing the criteria, then there's deference. Again, is there evidence to support your decision? Like an iota of evidence. Are you acting arbitrarily? Again, if they're identical, not really going to happen. And and you did one last week and you came it down the different way the next week, then that sounds kind of arbitrary. But it's got to get into the record too, right? So again, yes and no.
Yeah.
Don't act arbitrarily. Mm-hmm. Try to be consistent, And I think that, folks on the commission are going to say, we talked about this last week. What are you talking about now? So then you're going to get it on the record. So apply the facts to the criteria. Explain things so that there's a record.
Any other questions before we move on? Okay. So, okay. There's only 2 slides, so it's not much to control.
There's only 2 slides.
So this will be less painful. No, that was much painful. But so this is the process we were talking about earlier. This is Ordinance 2181, establishing the near-term site plan review process that you'll undertake, essentially through the end of the year, right? 180 days, 6 months. So the new process is that the application materials will be submitted to staff as normal. We'll do our usual review, analysis, et cetera, And
Can I interrupt? I'm sorry. See, I interrupt folks. So just for the benefit of folks of what we're talking about, we're talking about properties that are subject to new form zoning, which is a portion of the city.
Right.
So.
More specifically, it's the residential zone districts that are not PUDs, so planned unit developments. These are standard zone districts of R1, R1A, R2, and R3. Those zone districts. They each have a form zone overlay and have different form types that you can choose from. What has been established by Ordinance 2181 in the code now. So this 180-day period has a different process than what you'll have after this 180-day period elapses. So this first period is, there's a staff review and decision about what occurs on an application. Those will be posted. Those decisions and the reviews will be posted on the website on Guiding Golden. And then all of this is referred to Planning Commission at the next available meeting where you have a regular meeting. And it's put on your consent agenda if it's something that is deemed, where there's a decision by the director, it's put on the consent agenda, and planning commissioners can take the opportunity to review that. They should take the opportunity to review that. And if at that next available meeting there are some concerns that maybe the code was not followed correctly, that there's questions about whether or not the code was followed correctly, any three commissioners, that was changed at council for those of you who were involved in that recommendation. Any three commissioners can decide to pull it off the consent agenda, and then staff and the applicant have to be there ready for your questions and to make sure that you understand it. And so if you can then hear the answers to these questions from staff and the applicant, and you can decide to go along with to ratify the decision of the director, or you can deny that, or you can put conditions on that as well. And it's not a public hearing; it's a discussion. So there won't be an opportunity for the public to come during this process. They can come, but they can't speak to it in a hearing type process. It's really just a way for you to have a check on the review process, make sure in these initial months that things are working properly, and give you an opportunity to poke at that a bit. So if you don't pull it off the consent agenda and you just vote to approve the consent agenda, you are ratifying those decisions. So that's the ratification that Lori, Ms. Strand, was referring to earlier in the conversation. So
Council Strand, no, just kidding.
So that's how this initial period will work, and it's things don't automatically go to hearing anymore like they used to, and so the part just to give new members background on the new code, this chapter 1829. The intent was to provide more certainty, to have a form-based code that really gets at what the community is looking for, have a lot of community conversation to get those form types correct. And so the idea is to reduce the process a bit, and that was always a goal of this as an outcome of this, so that everyone gets more certainty. But council and planning commission recommended this too. There's this initial period where we have a little bit more of a check on the process to get used to it. So I think this is a good idea, and July should be your first opportunity to do that. There are situations in the new code where you will have a hearing process, and the example I gave at the beginning is one that will be coming to you likely in July, and that's what's called a major adjustment in the new code, and it's similar to a variance, but it doesn't require the determination of legal hardship. So it's an adjustment that planning commission can decide is warranted because it still fulfills the intent of the code. It's but there may be something about the project or the property that is causing something, causing a request for something different than the letter of the code. So it's a judgment call from Planning Commission, but you have to decide that it still meets the intent of the code. It's not just sort of a giveaway. It's, is this really getting at what we're trying to do here? And this is just sort of a way to accommodate that in a different way. So this is just site plan reviews, just residential, and just those zone districts that I mentioned. So it's not an all-encompassing change to the process, just confined to those situations.
Quick question.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry. In terms of process, and this is just for me being new, and also just the process being new as well.
Yeah.
But if a commissioner would like to pull an item from the consent agenda, when would be the appropriate time to do that? Would that be at the approval of the agenda, or would that be at the time of the approval of the consent agenda?
Let's see. So you would be, I think it would be at the approval of the consent agenda, right? That's how the council does it.
Council, yeah.
So when council gets to the consent agenda, and they is there a motion to approve the consent agenda? It would be, Madam Mayor, I'd like to take item such and such off of the consent agenda and have a discussion. And so I think that's how you would suggest it. And then your fellow commissioners, you'd have to have at least 2 commissioners along with you that say, you can justify it. You can say, I looked at this and I don't think that this standard was met. I feel like that, or I have questions about how it was met.
I don't know how it was applied, or this isn't. Mm-hmm.
And that could be enough to convince the at least 2 other commissioners say, I'm willing to take a look at that. I think that's a good conversation to have. And then you bring it up and we talk through it.
Okay.
On the consent agenda, because we've never had one of those before, does that have to be unanimous in order to approve the consent agenda?
I think it's just a majority vote.
No, it's just a majority
vote.
But again, if there's 3, if 4 voted and 3 didn't, then you would think that 3 maybe would pull something off. But maybe they have an issue with different ones, and so no.
They can band together.
I've never just seen dissenting votes on a consent agenda.
I've seen. Even here, I think it was early on. I think there was a council voted and 1 individual member didn't vote on
to approve the consent agenda.
Yeah, I feel like it was here, maybe somewhere else, but I've seen it before. Mm-hmm.
Another silly question. So if we pull one off the agenda, do we talk about it then, or do we go through and approve the entire consent agenda without that item and then move that to another part of the agenda?
No, I think you talk about it right there and then, and then you go back and approve the consent agenda after you've made a decision on that.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, that's right, correct? That's how.
I might do it differently, but it's I think either's fine.
I think it would work better the other way. Like if we've decided to pull something from the consent agenda, there's no reason to hold up the rest of the consent agenda.
Probably, I don't do council with you guys, but I would think that normally you would say, because you're like, here's 10 matters for consent. We want to pull this one off, so we're going to talk about it next, and then you finish up your consent.
Oh, the remaining consent agenda. So you would approve the remaining consent items. Okay.
Minus item
minus
B.
That one, and then you talk about that.
Yeah, we put item B at another portion of the agenda.
You know what council does? They actually move the item, I believe, to like I'd like
for
to
discussion
later in the agenda.
to item number 6, instead, and then your consent agenda doesn't have that on it anymore. And you can approve the rest of it.
We can check this procedural stuff too.
Okay.
And because I'll see how Kathy does it with City Council, and we'll
Sounds good.
Mirror it. But
I just imagine this is going to come up. I want to be prepared, not stumbling in public hearing, so thank you.
Yeah.
No, it's good. But they do talk about it at the consent agenda time. Oh, yeah.
So a question about it in practice. So we get the applications, we've reviewed them. We're on-ramping a new code. We can individually reach out as commissioners to staff and say, hey, I need to understand this better, or its relationship to other things, to understand the issue in the application. And then, but until the time of the hearing, everything we just talked about on the consent agenda doesn't need to be declared, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, if you just have a clarification question, you could just ask staff, and staff can say, it's actually this instead, or whatever. It doesn't need to. That doesn't necessarily then need to be pulled off the consent agenda if you're just asking clarification. But if you have an issue, It also, I think staff would appreciate a heads up if you say, I intend to pull,
To
then we,
freeze this as a potential.
yeah, I intend to sort of request this to be pulled off the consent agenda. Then we can be more prepared, and especially if you identify the item in particular, it might flow better. If you say this particular standard, I have some questions about.
Thanks.
So in that case, okay, we talked about like adding a discussion item on our agenda. If those come up, I think it would be worth if one commissioner has a question about it, not hold up the consent agenda, but like if you could talk to the rest of commission about what you told that one commissioner about how you applied that standard or whatever the email conversation you had.
Oh, just in the context of the meeting?
Yeah, like in the
Okay.
meeting, if you guys have
In that separate part of the agenda. So
Right.
if nothing's actually called off and the discussion doesn't happen there,
Yes.
it might be, to the extent it's informative, to say,
Yeah.
there was, we fielded a couple questions from a commissioner on the application of this standard for the benefit of folks.
Yeah.
I think that would be good for
Yeah.
all of us and also the
Yeah.
public as they're seeing things come through.
Yeah.
And it could inform if clarification is ultimately needed in the code too, right? If things aren't clear. So.
Okay. Any other questions on this interim process? Okay. So the longer term process after 180 days, this would no longer go up on your you wouldn't have the consent agenda piece any longer. This would go up on, the director would still make a decision after the analysis was done and report is written, it's posted on Guiding Golden, and there's this period of 30 days.
Is it still 30 days? I thought maybe it went to 21, but I don't know.
Oh, wait a minute, you might be right. It might be
It might be.
to check the ordinance.
I thought it went to either 21
Yeah,
or
because
28.
I didn't update
Yeah.
that.
21, you think?
I think
Or
it was
28.
21.
It was just to be on weeks rather
So it's
than.
an even, not
Yeah.
even, but.
Yeah.
I can't remember if it was
Okay.
21 or 28.
Yeah, I don't think it's 30 days, but.
We'll clarify that. It is 20-something days, you're correct. And so it would be posted on Guiding Golden, and that is the period of time where council and commission are both notified that it's been put on Guiding Golden. You can take a look at it and review it. Council, any two members of council, if they have questions about anything any decision that's been made on a site plan, or they disagree with something that it complies with the code, they can then pull that off of. They can do what's called the call up, and request that Planning Commission review it as a public hearing before Planning Commission, and so. That is something that could come your way, and after this 6-month period is over, and you'll of course be notified that it'll be on your agenda, and all those materials will be sent to you, and we'll prepare it the way we did before this whole thing happened, or how we will for commercial code items. So then you have that decision of either approving, denying, or approving with conditions during that call-up period process.
And I'm assuming, I think I know the answer, but we should treat any site plan application like we may hear it. And we shouldn't be having ex parte conversations with
Until that period is over.
anyone,
Yes,
including
very-
city
exactly.
council. And so just making sure that everyone,
Yep.
okay.
Because they're all, anything in the residential use districts are coming to your packet, right?
Or potentially, yeah.
Yeah, sure. That's a good point. So yeah, so that's how that will work in the future, and just see how it plays out. Anybody have any questions?
I actually do have a
More?
question on the long term. If these are all supposed to be, treated as ex parte, and council is the only people who can call them up, but that's a lot of burden on council. I mean, can a resident email council and say?
Oh, sure.
So
Yeah.
how does?
I assume that will be how.
But does
could happen the
that
most.
count as an ex parte conversation?
If we're the decision makers, I think that we would be the ones subject to the ex parte. It wouldn't be city council.
But we couldn't look at it and say, hey, 2 council members, you should pull this up.
That's my impression.
Well,
That's a good question.
That's kind of what I was trying to get at too.
Yeah, and I remember there was a study such, because I think an earlier form was it to have either body be able to call it
Yeah,
up?
that
And then
was
council
one
was like, no, that's just too complicated.
Isn't that what we asked?
We asked for that, yeah.
They were thinking that a commissioner could reach out to you guys. So you could reach out to commissioner and say, hey, we're kind of concerned. I'm not aware because you're not talking amongst yourself. I'm kind of concerned. So I think that's the idea, that you could reach out to a council member.
A singular one of us.
And then
Singular.
and then they could reach out to another council member to get
That's
the
why it's two for them.
So, but I couldn't email Casey and Bill. I would just choose one of them to say.
I think that's a good idea. I mean, the open meetings law, when it says 3 members, it's of the body. It's not a combination of bodies. But I think it's probably just, again, I always err on side of caution, so, pick your council member.
But we can email.
And a member of the public can as well. So, and that's what's anticipated. I mean, they're anticipated that this would happen. But I don't know that you should be having communications with members of the public. Refer them to their council members.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think that when we get to this point, we should spend some, time and brain power on how this is kind of presented on the website too, to inform the public on how best to reach out, so they're not calling all of you, that they are reaching out to their council member, so we can kind of do some brain damage on that as well, just to direct them in the right direction.
That's all from me. If there are no more questions.
So I just have a quick question. So we should assume that if it's on the consent agenda, that you guys have gone over everything and you think every box has been checked, it meets all the criteria, compliance, everything?
Yeah, and there'll be, there will be staff report information there for you to read, and so you can, it's, similar to what you do now, or what you have done in the past, which is to see how the criteria have been met or not met, and if you don't think that the submittal aligns with, staff's determination, or you just have questions about it, you're not sure, that's when you can step in.
So the applicants will come to the meeting where that consent agenda is?
Yeah, during this period,
They all
they'll need to
just have
come.
show up?
Yeah.
Is there any sort of maximum number of cases that would be on a consent agenda?
Nothing established in code. It can be if you say uncle after we 20 cases, I don't know that it'll get. I think we'll get. For the first few months, we'll probably get a sizable amount. But
By sizable, do you mean like 2 or 20, or I'm thinking that, because we have to review all of them.
Yeah,
and just to make sure that 47 is less than.
I think so. For example, yeah. Well, but there's limited staff time too, so you're protected from in some way.
Your bandwidth.
Can't hire anybody else.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, so, I think this time there's roughly, for July, there would be roughly, I think there's like 5-ish.
Okay. 5's doable.
Yeah, and some of them are pretty small, they're just like additions that happen to hit the trigger for site plan review, because now we're doing like single family. There's going to be one single family that, hits the trigger. And so you'll be, there'll be additions that you aren't used to seeing in some cases.
One last question. I'm trying to not do too many what ifs, but would there ever be anything that you would call off from a staff level that wouldn't be on a consent agenda that is a topic that has to do with the code more systemically, that might lead to a code amendment or something that where you might be pulling it out for specifically? And
I think, I don't think we would pull it off to have a hearing about it, just because it calls into question an element of the code and whether we should change the policy of the code. That's kind of what you're getting at, right?
So it would be non-compliance. It wouldn't proceed through the process.
Or it could be compliance, but you don't like it. That might be another thing. It would be like, because you could see denials on here too. I mean, the consent agenda could have a denial on there.
Oh,
That was my
okay, great.
question too.
Yeah, and you could disagree with that denial. You could say, I think staff shouldn't have denied this, or I want to hear more about it, or the applicant will just plan to appeal and go through that process. So it could be a variety of things. But one thing for Kevin and Ross to know, because during this process we talked about having in the agenda itself to have an item that says, is there anything from this from this conversation related to the code that we should schedule for a future conversation? So like you see something and you say, well, it met code, but I don't like it. We should maybe talk about changing this provision of code. And that would be an opportunity at the end of the meeting to say, let's schedule some time to talk about this in more depth.
And I think the idea really, and one of the ideas is to have more eyes looking at it to establish trends on, are there common modifications that are being sought to where that's indicative that perhaps a text amendment is appropriate? Are there common themes of that subsequent conversation, not a specific thing saying this is not what we thought was going to happen.
Yeah.
Those are the things that are ripe for conversations about text amendments. But particularly when you have a lot of the idea for variances and administrative modifications, and the major modification is that if you're seeing a lot of the same ones and you're approving a lot of the same ones, then that's probably warrants relooking at the code, right? So we're trying to capture, to the extent we can, this isn't what we expected category, and we think this is okay. We shouldn't really be not denying this again and again and again, or we shouldn't be forcing people to go through some sort of modification process again and again and again, because we're okay with this. So those kind of two categories are things that, we should be looking out for.
Yeah, and then we're already we're anticipating some already, so we'll see how it plays out.
Just maybe one of several new person questions, but what sort of time frame? I mean, when do things come out? How do we receive them? And so, how much time do we have to look at it before the meeting?
Yeah, I mean, so typically your packets come out to you a week prior to the meeting, and it'll have all that information there.
Like the one this time.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Exactly. So we try to get the packets out on the electronic version. We try to get out on Wednesday, and then if it's this wasn't a very substantive packet. It was just meeting minutes. So, but where there's a lot to it, we will have you'll get mailed a copy of the packet as well. But a week in advance is how that goes. If we have them earlier and it's a big case, we try to get them to you earlier too. But that's what we're required to do. And oftentimes the applicants are the ones who are like, this is my submittal deadline, this is my, so we're kind of working against, their wanting more time, and us trying to, we still need time for review, we need, yeah. But it's I think it's generally, for most cases, it's plenty of time. I think, I remember the first Coors Tech hearing was sort of overwhelming. I know. That won't be a regular thing, obviously.
Is the week practical as well as meeting the posting requirements? Is that?
Well, the posting happens earlier.
The posting requirements happen.
Yeah. It's because the notice has to go out. Even if the packet isn't complete and ready to send out, the notice that the hearing is happening and the signs all have to go out earlier than that. They're 12 days.
Go Avs.
Go Avs. All right. Is that all for everyone?
Do we have anything? Do you have new business?
There's no new business unless
Nothing.
you decide there is.
Oh, no. I think we already covered that in the hearing portion.
Oh, that's
so
right. An hour study session. Yep.
I think we're okay. Our next meeting will be July 20th.
Yeah, July 20th.
Okay.
So July 6th, you'll have that night off, and we'll see you on July 20th.
So usually sometime in July or August, we have a walkability, bikeability recommendation, stuff to council study session.
Yeah.
Are
so
we doing that this year?
Well, we're probably doing it in a bit of a bigger way. So one of the goals of this year is to get started on a bicycle and pedestrian master plan. And we have a new planner who joined us, and his name is Matt, and he is beginning that process. And so I think we are planning to schedule that conversation in August as kind of a kickoff for you all to talk about what we should be focusing, the scope of the bike pedestrian plan, the outreach process, and so forth. But we can also do recommendations for a priority list if you like at that time too. I'll make note of that.
All right. Do I close the meeting? It's not officially.
Yeah, there's no real motion you need. It's just you
Adjourn.
decide you're
Class
adjourned.
dismissed.